Hello, everyone. We're so glad you're here at Aspen Ideas Fest with us. I'm Jenn White. I host 1A from WAMU and NPR in DC. I saw some snaps in the audience. Thank you very much for that. We're here to talk about polarization in the country and how to find common ground. And I'm sure this is a conversation we've all had with people in our lives. Some of us have maybe even fallen out with family members or friends around certain issues. And having good faith arguments these days can feel next to impossible when we can't even agree on facts. So you throw social media into that mix and you have our current situation. So we're going to talk today about whether it's possible to find common ground. And we have a wonderful panel here to take us through that very difficult question. Austin Channing Brown is an author, speaker, and media producer. She's CEO of Herself Media and the New York Times and US Today best-selling author of I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. She's also host and executive producer of the video web series on racial justice. It's called The Next Question. We also have Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist at NYU Stern School of Business. His research examines the intuitive foundations of morality and how morality varies across cultural and political divides. He's co-founded organizations and collaborations that apply social and moral psychology to help groups and systems work better, including heterodoxacademy.org. To my left, we have Lauren Leader, co-founder and CEO of All In Together. That's a nonpartisan organization training American women on civic leadership. She's also author of the book Crossing the Thinnest Line and several research studies on women's issues. And our last minute addition to our panel, thankfully he was willing to step in, is Julian Castro. He's the founder of People First Future Political Action Committee, which helps elect progressive candidates. He's also an MSNBC and NBC political analyst and host of Our America with Julian Castro. That's a podcast. Of course, he was a 2020 presidential candidate. And he's also the former Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and former mayor of San Antonio, Texas. So thanks to you all for joining us. We are going to have about 15 minutes at the end of this session for questions. So as you're listening to this conversation, start to think about what you want to know, okay? I want to start with just a round robin question because I think it's important to start with definitions and sort of a common ground about what we're talking about. And I'm curious what each of you think is at the core of our nation's current polarization. And Julian, I'll start with you.
Fear of demographic change.
That's simple.
Yeah, I mean, that undergirds a lot of it, yeah.
Yeah. Jonathan, what about you?
Well, I think there are long-running trends by which left and right, Republican and Democrat have begun to dislike each other. That's what we mean by affective or emotional polarization. And when that goes beyond certain levels, it becomes real hatred. And at that point, the ends justify the means. And there's a lot of research in political science showing that when people get to that point, they're willing to tolerate their side doing things like storming the Capitol and doing illegal activities. So now that we've passed the point of sort of normal boundaries of cross-partisan dislike, anything's possible. And our democracy is in enormous danger from that.
Austin, what do you think is at the core?
Yeah. I think America has yet to deal with its own history around race, around class, around a whole host of issues. And because of that, we have not charted a way forward. We don't actually have a shared common vision of what the future is. And so all of our futures are competing. We're competing for the futures that we want.
Lauren, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. For sure, and I think we haven't invested enough as a society, and maybe this builds on Austin's point, we haven't invested enough in equipping people, empowering our friends and neighbors with the tools for how to connect with people who are different from themselves. You know, we throw Americans together in the office and in communities, but we don't ever really talk about the fact that it is actually hard to build bonds with people that you perceive as really different. And you know, there are examples around the world, you know, reconciliation in South Africa after the end of apartheid. We heard an amazing example on the main stage yesterday of someone who found forgiveness and reconciliation with the man that killed his son. You know, these are deep human experiences, but we need to have the tools and the systems to foster all of us doing that in individual and collective ways.
Julian and Austin, I really heard in some ways different sides of the same coin in your answer. Julian, yours referred to fear of a certain type of future, and Austin, yours was about reckoning with the past. And Austin, I'd first like to hear you expand on that a bit. How do you think our lack of willingness to reckon with that past, to really grapple with it, affects the polarization we see today?
Well, whether or not we, at this point, whether or not we can talk about our history and our past is even up for grabs, right? There is a lot of talk right now around banning books, around whether or not CRT is being taught. What is CRT, and is it actually in any of our math books? You know, and so we have long had an inability to talk about the ways America has failed certain citizens in this country. And until we learn to talk about it and decide what future we want, I don't know what the way forward is. So I have a deep desire for there to be more spaces, right, not less, more spaces where we can talk through where we've been and where we want to go.
Well, Leon, how do you connect the dots between what Austin just described and that fear of shifting demographics that you talked about?
Well, and I think that she definitely hits the nail on the head. I mean, we've always had these divisions and suppressed them in a lot of ways and oppressed populations. And I think what's happened in the last few years is social media that has sort of thrown gasoline on the flame. You know, a certain former president that was the most shameless that any presidential politician has been in a long time, much less somebody in office, of using that, exploiting that to worsen that division and polarization. And so it's everything from the past that we never resolved and the biases that too often still exist, matched with 21st century tools, and unfortunately, 21st century politicians who are all too willing to exploit it. But underneath all of that is difference and fear of difference and the fact that, you know, there's a population growth that is troubling or worrisome to a lot of folks.
Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd like to first agree with something Austin said about how there's no possibility of shared meanings anymore. There's no sort of shared narrative of anything, and it's all fighting for bits of meaning. And another thing that she said is that she's not even sure that we can talk about these things anymore. I agree with that. I think it's much harder to talk now than it was 10 years ago.
Right.
And so I'd just like to try out something I've been thinking, which is, so I was born in 1963, 2 months after Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech, which means 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. In those 100 years, how much progress was there? How much racial progress was there? Some, but not a lot in 100 years. And then you go from 1963 to 2013, when I turned 50. How much progress has there been? Quite a lot on not just black civil rights, but gay rights, women's rights, animal rights, environmental concerns. So if you're concerned about justice issues, social justice issues, I think you should look at that 50-year period, my first 50 years, as among the most amazing periods of progress in human history. And then the question becomes, why did everything go to hell after that? And it wasn't because Obama was elected, because his first term was actually, you know, the problem wasn't the first term, it was in the second term. I think it has nothing to do with Obama. My argument, which I made in this Atlantic article a few weeks ago, 2 months ago, was that social media changed the basic parameters by which we connect and relate in public, not here. We're not afraid of each other here in this room. But if this was happening on Facebook Live or Twitter or anywhere else, then the things we're saying to each other would be I would not be like responding to or talking to Austin. I'd be thinking about the people who are going to shoot darts in me. And we would not be having a conversation. We'd be doing 5 different performances. So I think we need to look at America as a country with enormous promise, enormous flaws, incredible progress on those flaws, and then we need to put our heads together and say, why did it all go to hell after around 2013, 2014?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Lauren.
Well, so, all right. I can't totally go down the rabbit hole of like everything's a disaster, and Austin and I talked about this last week. I actually think there are some remarkable signs of potential and unity in the country today that are not popular to focus on, because actually part of the, you know, we used to say, you know, media, you'd say it bleeds, it reads. It divides, it abides, okay? The more that our divisive The divisive moments in our country get amplified the more that we believe they're there. I am not Pollyanna. I'm not saying they're not there. But I also think there are these signs all around us of what is remarkably enduring about the American ideal that actually is something that holds us together. In the January 6th hearings, we could talk all day long about all the ways in which the January 6th hearings represent the worst of our divisions, right? The storming of the Capitol, et cetera. But also, there was this extraordinary group of patriots who believed in our Constitution, who believed in these very core central principles about who we are, which is that we are a representative democracy and no one person, king, or elite group has the right to overturn the voice of the people. And under enormous pressure and duress, people who voted for Trump, like the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Arizona, like the unbelievable young woman Cassidy Hutchinson yesterday, like Liz Cheney, we don't agree on a lot of things. But they stood up for democracy. They stood up for a core value that Americans share. And the other thing which I think is tied to this is that when you look at, I study civics, I teach civics. When you look at the measures of where Americans are on civic education, they've actually increased, they've improved. Americans actually do understand some core things about what unite us and about what we all agree on that our system is based on. So I only say this to say, yes, there's a lot of challenges, but we also have strengths to build from, and I think we have to do more of that, that if we're constantly throwing up our hands and saying it's all broken because we can't change what the social media companies are gonna do, and that's clearly part of this, it's disempowering. And I want us to see not just what's wrong, but also what the path to progress is.
I do want to get to some solutions in a moment, but something you said stood out to me as you were talking about the effort to overturn the 2020 election. Because it sometimes feels like there are two different but connected types of polarization, right? So you have social or community polarization, right? The conversations you have with people in your life, your friends, your family, the people you live around. But then you've got the politics and the policy, right? And the politics and the policy may not even reflect what Americans believe, which is very complex.
Yeah.
But that politics piece, the policy, it does impact people's lives.
That's right.
And so often when I'm talking to people on the show and we're talking about some of the policy initiatives that have emerged in the past several years, they say it feels like people are asking me to find common ground or to compromise on my humanity. And I don't know how to do that. Austin, I see you nodding. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, there's, compromise and figuring out policies and negotiations is easy when you're not impacted by them. So for example, I have never been in the criminal justice system. And so it's really easy for me to advocate for certain measures and to let other measures go and to say, well, that was a victory, we'll get that other one next time, right? But when I know people who have been incarcerated, when I know people who are impacted by that tactic that I said, or by that policy that I said, you know what, that's okay, right? Or if I was impacted by the carceral system, the stakes are higher, right? The stakes are so much higher. And it often feels like those who are figuring out public policy don't have a stake. And I understand the ways in which social media is extraordinarily problematic, but it also has contributed to the democratization of my voice. Because I, as a girl who is sitting in the middle of Detroit, Michigan.
Wait, you're from Detroit?
Well, not from, but that's where I live right now.
Okay, I'm from Detroit. I'm sorry, I had a moment. Go ahead.
Anybody else from Detroit? Anyone else? Oh, hey. Right? I now have a voice that I otherwise would not have. MSNBC is not calling me to give my opinion on SCOTUS decisions.
Although we clearly need to fix that.
Do you know what I mean? That there's a whole group of activists and organizers and people who otherwise wouldn't have a say in their own lives and the policies that impact their lives that now can because of social media. I would agree, though, that the transformation, right, the coming together, has often taken place, in my experience, off social media, right? It has taken place in more intimate settings and in classrooms and in conferences and in places where it's okay to ask the question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? But I do want to underline, right, that so much of the policy that we're talking about, it isn't that, that we care more now than we used to, right? Black folks cared a whole lot about the Civil Rights Movement, about the Voting Rights Act, about, right? It's not that we didn't care, it was that the avenues in which we could express ourselves weren't present. So we had to rely on a single voice like MLK or Rosa Parks or Fannie Lou Hamer. But now Austin Channing Brown can get on social media and be like, I'm sorry, you doing what? And this is why so many young folks like myself are so annoyed with the Democratic Party, right? We might be snarky with the far right. You know, but we're annoyed with the people who are supposed to represent us in those policies because it doesn't feel like they have a stake in the policies that they are advocating for on our behalf.
Julian, when you hear Austin's comments, and as someone who has served at some of the highest levels of government, how do you think about that disconnect at times between policy and politics and the kinds of connections that need to happen for people to find that common ground that, as Lauren said, it's actually happening in places across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes work to stay connected to the people that you represent or the people that you serve. You know, I could see this clearly because I started out in local politics, running for city council, and then I was mayor of my hometown. And there's nothing, it's true what they say, there's nothing like running for office at the local level where you're knocking on people's doors and having conversations, you know, in neighborhood association meetings or other meetings with groups and hearing directly from people and being accountable to them, you know, 3 feet away from them, or after COVID, maybe 6 feet away from them. But there's no hiding, basically, and that's good. And it also means that people have to, you know, at least hear, if not listen, to what people are saying. I think part of this conversation, because I agree about the empowerment of social media, there are definitely good elements to it, right, and empowerment. And also, you know, when you look at the people in office, and the higher you go, the more this is true, it's not reflective of the diversity of America or the diversity of experience, not only of ethnic and racial background, but by income level and in other ways. It's not reflective of it. And that plays into whether people, all of that plays into whether people feel a certain sense of urgency. I think just the last thing I'll say is, most recently with this Roe decision, there are a lot of folks who feel like there's not enough urgency in the administration and otherwise, not only there, but a sense of, hey, this was an earthquake. This just shifted everything. And we expected more outrage and sense of what are you gonna try and do and go all out to do it. It doesn't seem to meet that moment right now.
Jonathan, is the current polarization unique to the US, or is it something we're seeing globally?
It's much greater in the US than in any other country. I've been collecting all the publications I can find on polarization, social media, all of that. Mark Zuckerberg claims that, oh, in some countries it's up, in some it's down, there's no relation to social media. And 5 years ago that was true, but it's not true anymore. In the US, polarization, affective polarization, how much we hate the other side, has been rising since the late 90s, early 2000s, pretty steadily. And it's much higher here than any other country, any of the major democracies. However, beginning in the mid-2010s, we start seeing a democratic recession. We see the number of democracies has declined since around 2015. It hit a peak around 2011, right when social media becomes hyper-viralized and much more damaging. So it took a couple years for it to do its damage, but since 2015, the number of democracies is down. The quality, on a negative 10 to positive 10 scale, the quality of them is down, including in the US. They have more authoritarian and undemocratic elements. Polarization is rising around the world. So this is a global phenomena, and I believe that the only way to explain this recent trend, the recent piece, is the change in social media. And just to speak to a point that Austin made, what she was describing about how it's giving voice, this was the promise, this was the hope. And in 2011, this was what we all thought, especially after the Arab Spring. We all thought the ultimate in democratic empowerment, what dictator could stand in the way? But I would submit that since then, the dream has not been realized, and that in fact, who ends up now having more voice because of social media? And what I argued in my Atlantic essay was it's the far left, the far right trolls, like individual men. They're always men who are just complete jerks, and they enjoy harassing people. They now have 1,000 times more influence than they did 10 years ago. And Russian intelligence agents and other agents. So in other words, yes, certain people have much more voice, but the middle 80% of the country actually kind of has less voice. And I would also urge that we distinguish between social media like Facebook, Twitter, those things, and blogs and podcasts, which are incredible. Those are really, really good. So if you want to get your word out, and you also mentioned the importance of empathy, nobody gets empathy from a tweet. I mean, maybe from a short video. But a podcast or a blog post where you really can explain yourself, you don't have to you don't have to go to an editor of the New York Times or the Atlantic. You can put it out there. So I just like to say a lot of the technology is good for fostering empathy and letting people like Austin have a voice, but I don't think we should give that benefit or that praise onto Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or any of those platforms. I think those have been gigantic net negatives to democracy and voice.
As someone who deals with a whole lot of trolls, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
No, that's right.
one quick point I'd make.
Just at the final point, I forgot to say, the research shows, you don't need to research this, women and black people get harassed the most. So it's not clear to me that this thing has been a net positive for black women.
No, agree.
Okay.
Joaquin, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, I mean, I think that I agree with you fundamentally on those two platforms, but like they have a very low barrier of entry, relatively low barrier of entry. Doing your own blog or podcast, even though it doesn't seem like much higher, really is a higher barrier, to entry. As somebody that has a podcast myself, but look, there are a lot more people that are able to just get on Facebook or get on Twitter or another social media than to create their own blog or their own podcast. Right?
Yeah, sorry, please.
I want to move on to another point. What do you think it means today to find common ground? What does that functionally look like? And Lauren, I want to come to you first, and if you have a concrete example you can share with us, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and I think it's important if we're framing this in this sort of town hall of like what the pieces of this are. I think there are different pieces. There are a whole host of really core issues that Americans mostly agree on, actually to pretty significant numbers, right? Year after year, Pew, and we do polls on this, and looking at some very core values issues for America, and the numbers are not super divisive, actually. I mean, abortion is a really important example of this, right? The system broke, but Americans mostly agree that abortion rights should be codified in law. When it comes to gay rights, the evolution on gay rights in this country over the last 30 years
Massive.
is stunning.
So fast, yeah.
Stunning, right? You have vast majorities of Americans of both parties who agree that gay rights are human rights and that people should have the right to marry whoever they want. That is an unbelievable point of unity, and it crosses political lines. On the sort of basics of women's equality in American society, most Americans agree women should have the right to the same jobs and the same pay, and they should be treated equally. And then to the point I made before about this core value about representative democracy. So in those ways, Americans are actually much closer together than we give them credit for. But on the flip side, it also makes it so painful to look at this broken system, which is amplifying the worst of where we are, right? Gerrymandering, this Supreme Court decision this morning, which is just atrocious, which is going to make it worse. I looked at it in Florida and Texas, the two states that are now going to be, enacting some of the most restrictive abortion rules. In Florida, there were a fourth of the state ledge seats that were seated in this cycle that not a single Democrat ran against. They were just totally unopposed seats. It was 37 of the seats in the Texas state legislature. So the system is broken in a bunch of ways that I think we all appreciate. But what works is, and what there is to build from, is that A, we still do in fact have a functioning representative democracy. And we did not have a successful coup d'etat. The government was not overthrown. Our institutions did hold, and they held because of what unites us. So that means that we also, in our system, are uniquely empowered to fix the things that are broken. It's not an overnight fight. It's probably a 50-year fight. It's probably the fight of our lifetimes, but it's not inaccessible. And so when I think about like, you know, the communities that I work with, I run one of the few nonpartisan women's political organizations, and I'll tell you, my friends on the left say to me all the time, I'm so glad you're educating women on voting and politics. I hope you're not educating those Republican women, okay? If you believe in democracy, I'm sorry, and I said this on this very stage 3 years ago, if you believe in democracy, you do have to believe that everyone's participation matters, even when we do not agree. We can draw the line at hate, and we should. We should draw the line at hate, and we need to empower candidates that are gonna go take out those that are hateful. I have to do a quick shout out to my friend Adam Frisch in the audience, who, if you don't know, won the primary last night here in Colorado and will be running against Lauren Boebert, who might be one of the most divisive, hateful people. There's no room in American politics for people that are that hateful and that divisive. But we can also, there is also a path to, you know, fixing these problems, electing people that actually are not burning down the house all the time.
So when it comes to sort of like a functional exercise, someone
Yeah.
saying, hey, I have a neighbor or
Yeah.
a friend or a family member, and we just don't see eye to eye on, choose an issue. I will
Right.
let you choose.
Yeah.
If you've had a conversation like that, what is the common ground that you found? Because I'm assuming it was an agreement, right? You didn't move off of your position, they didn't move off of theirs.
Look, I am staunchly pro-choice. I spent my whole life fighting for abortion rights, and I have multiple pro-life women that sit on my board, okay? And these are women with whom I have deep disagreements politically, but we have a lot of shared values. We look at this issue very differently, but they're actually deep relationships, and my relationships with them have actually been some of the most rewarding of my life because we're so different. And I wrote a whole book about this, that when we can find these points of human connection, the things where we do agree, and I want to say 50 times, you draw the line at hate. Someone who wants your destruction, who wants to destroy you, who doesn't believe that you have a right to exist, that's the line. There's no room for that. But most people are not in that space. Most people are somewhere else. They're somewhere in the middle. And it's very human to try to find these bonds. And there's a political side of it too. You know, and Rob Portman last night, I mean, what an interesting example. We were all people were booing him last night. You know what, Rob Portman was one of the few Republicans in the Senate. I disagree with him on a million things. But this is a guy who built bridges, and he actually did do bipartisan work. I don't agree with him with a lot of things, but if I'm constantly burning him down because he didn't agree with me 100% of the time, like, we're lost. And we have to be able to do that. We have to compromise. Our system was built for compromise.
Austin, I want to come to you next because I'm curious to hear,
Sorry.
when you hear, oh, no. When you hear about finding the middle.
I know it makes you crazy. I know you hate it.
I'm curious how you
I
react
think
to that.
I do. I do hate it. I hate it. But I hate it because I think there is a very real difference in how the two of us experience America. Because I am often met with people who do want my destruction. I am often met with people who do not think that I should have a right to my own life, who do not think that I should be able to vote, who do not think that I deserve good choices and second chances, right? And so what does compromise look like for me, right? I want to be open and honest and say that I don't spend a whole lot of time trying to find compromise or middle ground. And that's just the truth. I spend much more time trying to educate and trying to cast a vision of America that does hold all those values, right, that the stats say we agree on, right? But in order to embody, require change. It requires that we do something different. It requires that we pass new laws. It requires that we enforce the ones we've already got, Hello Voting Rights Act,
100%.
right? And so, I think compromise is good and it is necessary. And I also think that we all have different roles in this conversation. I need you right where you are. I hope that there are a lot of other people who need me right where I am, right? And I think that I think that even the category of polarization, even as someone who receives a lot of hate and trolls, is difficult for me because I am in the pursuit of the left, right? I want all women to have a choice, not just the ones who voted for a Democrat. Right? The things that I want for all Americans. But it's hard for me to sit in a room where compromise is the goal of the room, because I am keenly aware of the people who do hate me.
So Jonathan, when you hear sort of the tension between, but it's a loving tension.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
And you think about that through the lens of your research. What does it tell you about the state of our democracy right now?
Yeah. Well, I'd prefer to work directly on this and suggest that a productive way forward is not to think about compromise or middle ground, it's to think about persuasion. And so here, I always recommend to all of my students, I recommend read Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's the most incredible book. And I created...
Sorry, there's just an audible moment from Lauren. Lauren had a visceral reaction to that.
That was out loud, I'm sorry.
And I created a program, so I co-founded Heterodox Academy to promote viewpoint diversity in universities. We created a program called Open Mind, if you go to openmindplatform.org, to teach undergraduates, freshmen, the skills of how do you, don't get locked into fighting or arguing, how do you actually persuade someone? And we're calling it now mutual persuasion, because you actually learn when you listen to people, and usually you're right about the things you care most about, and they're right about the things they care most about, but you're not listening to each other, so you don't learn. So if you put it in those terms, that the goal, especially of activists, the goal should be persuasion, and of course while being open to having your views improved by new input. And to do that, what I find is the most powerful tools, and this is from Dale Carnegie, this is from most everybody, is first find something you have in common, and I think policy issues are not the best. What I found from, I see this over and over again, like in the early civil rights movement, it's actually religion, especially shared, Christianity was a big part of the civil rights movement and of the appeal, grounding in Christian virtues. A sense of Americanism that is uplifting, which Martin Luther King was brilliant at invoking, and Barack Obama was too. Think about Daryl Davis, a black blues musician who has talked a bunch of Ku Klux Klan members out of the robes. How did he do it? He says it in every speech. He says, I listen. I commit to listening to them until they've said everything they need to say, and then they listen to me. But it's not just that. It's often bonding over religion and music. When he gets that connection, he's got them. So I think we need to think about persuasion as a thing where two people who are now locked away in these separate bubbles of meaning, even more than we were 10 years ago. So it's harder to persuade people, but you can do it. There are skills of doing it.
I'm sorry I had that reaction and that wasn't fair. And the reason I did is because I have spent a lifetime being told that like the white male models of how business is supposed to work and how all these things are supposed to work is the way we're all supposed to lead. And I recoiled because when women try to be persuasive, when women do this, it is to your point, Austin, it is a different experience. And so I'm sorry that I reacted the way I did. That was unfair, and I appreciate your point. But I just wanted to explain why I had that visceral reaction to that.
Okay, no, I know. The 1937 version of How to Win Friends and Influence People is extremely dated.
Yeah, I bet.
That.
Yeah.
I bet.
But he's talking about the men people.
But I think Lauren brings up an interesting point in that who's working to do the persuading right now, to do that work you're describing?
Yeah.
And Julian, you're out talking to people, you've served. I mean, who's doing that work?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people are doing that work, from individuals to nonprofits to public elected officials. I think one of the ways to look at that is, even though a lot of people are doing it, who has the loudest voices and the biggest audience? And unfortunately, we're living in a time where some of the people on media, especially with the biggest audiences and the loudest voices, are preaching exactly the opposite: division and polarization and thinking of Austin and others a certain way, worsening the situation. But I think also, in our own way, all of us can be a part of trying to persuade, whether you have a big platform or not. And perhaps, Austin, that's what you're, through social media or other ways, we can do that. And it's important for us to do it. I also think about it in terms of when do people that hold biases or myths in their head about certain folks, when do they have a chance to reality test?
Yeah.
And to see that that's not the case. Is it in their church group? Is it in their homeowners association or neighborhood association or some club or at work or somewhere else, right? I feel like, so many of us have become accustomed to looking at our screens for so long, and that's how our kids are growing up too, and we haven't made the progress that we ought to, although we have made a lot in desegregating our schools and so forth, that when do people get to reality test, and so that you don't have to persuade them as much, about everybody's humanity and about needs, especially that communities have. I always think about, as a policymaker, how do you create more of those spaces in what we do, through governing?
I want to get, again, to solutions more, but I also feel like it's really important to acknowledge the fact that this work is labor. It is labor, and it can be exhausting. I think if you are persuading from the position of a marginalized group, that is a lot to ask. So I'm curious to hear from particularly Lauren and Austin. I know, Austin, you said you're not really trying to persuade, but you still are doing a
No, opposite, right?
Oh,
so I am trying to
you're
persuade.
trying to persuade. So,
right?
but how do you grapple
but that
with the
middle
piece of it?
ground?
You're not looking for that.
Not a middle ground.
But how do you grapple with that?
Yeah.
That cost and still feel like what you're doing is worth it?
Woo, that is a question that I have to ask myself on a very regular basis. I most often come back to two thoughts. And one is that I will absolutely resist the lie that I am not a full human being. And because I am a full human being, I am worthy of joy and delight and pleasure and watching movies and dancing with my kid and retail therapy and, other things that make me happy, that my whole life I am not meant to be the mule of the world. Right? That my whole life is not about my labor and what I can contribute. And so trying to take my work as equally important as my being is one thing. And then I also care a lot about boundaries. And so I'm going to be a little sarcastic here, but I often, before I engage in conversation, you need to submit like a cover letter and an application, like I need to know, are you in this, And the way that looks like in real life is if someone says to me, hey, I don't understand why you're pro-choice. You're a Christian and you're pro-choice. Help me understand. Before I will respond, I will send an article, 1,200, 1,500 words, read this, let me know when you finished. Because if you don't have time to read 1,200 words and come back to me, then I'm guessing you're not actually interested in being persuaded. You're not actually asking how I arrived at my choices, at my decisions. You actually just want to fight. And I don't have time to fight, right? I don't have it in me to fight just for the sake of fighting. So I will persuade on those Christian values all day long. I will shout from the rooftops about what I believe about God and Jesus. MLK, fantastic preacher on the Constitution, right? Like not just the Bible, fantastic preacher on the Constitution. And I can do that all day long, right? But to fight with someone who actively does not want to be persuaded, who just wants to convince me of my own inhumanity is not work that I'm signing up for anymore.
Lauren, what about you?
So it is my labor of life, and partially because I feel that it has to be, because I was born with the privilege that I have, partially because I have 3 Black daughters, and I want to make the world better for them, partially because I feel like it was my calling and I have to, and I have the ability and the platform to do it, and so there's not a day that I don't spend trying to fight. And not everyone should have to do that, but that's what I feel my calling is. Look, I think I want progress, and I want people's lives to be better, and I find it very demoralizing. I can't, so one of my favorite quotes, I said this to Austin last week, is when Desmond Tutu died, a friend called me to tell me about this remarkable conversation she had had with him about his lifelong fight for justice. And she asked him at some point, how do you keep going? How do you, in the face of what seems like impossible odds, how do you sustain your commitment to this work? And he said, I am a prisoner of hope. That changed my life. And I think, you know, I spend my days trying to help empower and motivate women who have extremely difficult life circumstances, who live at the margins, to see the political process as worth their time, because I want their voices heard, and I want political leaders to know about their lives and to understand what it means to deal with the police when you've been abused by your husband, or when you're facing you know, food or housing insecurity. I want our political leaders to hear from them. But the only way that I can do that, the only way that I can get them to speak up and step forward and, in their very difficult circumstances, make an effort, is by persuading them that it's worth it and that we can make it better. And the only way that you do that is by showing a path to some sort of progress, which isn't always perfect. It took years to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. Well, you know what it took to do that? It took two people who vehemently disagree on absolutely everything else. It took Kristen Gillibrand and Senator Murkowski. They don't agree on anything, but they were able to get the Violence Against Women Act passed, and that's gonna save millions of lives. And it's gonna make sure there's funding for women who are, and non-binary people. I mean, this was like a huge thing that kept this bill from getting passed for years, was the gay rights dimension of it, the native rights dimension of it. But they passed a bill. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. But to me, like, it's progress. And so that's why I'm willing to invest in trying to sometimes find the middle. I'm not gonna get everything I want. I don't agree with all of it, but I can't bear the idea that if I don't compromise, if I'm unwilling to compromise, if none of us will compromise, then nothing will happen. And the gun bill is another example. Like, how do we not give some credit? Is it what we all want? No, of course we should ban assault weapons. It's ridiculous. But you know, it's something. And they found, these people who could not agree on anything found something to agree on after 35 years. Like, let's build from that. And if we burn it all down every time they make a compromise, like, we're gonna go nowhere.
Julian, you mentioned that, our institutions could do a better job of creating space, providing opportunity for us to find common ground. In what way?
Oh, I think in so many different ways, in all types of ways that now I'll speak, you know, with my experience in government, in all types of ways that governments function, from the way that we design cities, so that people come together in something as simple as a public park or recreational area, to mass transit, investing in. I often thought when I was in Boston going to school that, like, people interact, and I don't know how much they have long conversations, but at least get to interact and see people and be around people that they otherwise might not be on that T in Boston or the Metro in New York, or that they wouldn't if you're just driving in your car every day, right? Or even bicycling to work or something. And so in that way, I think obviously in the investments that we make, particularly in education, that's why what they're doing right now is so dangerous, because I think that understanding other people and the history of other people, and, you know, appreciating difference because you understand that history, is so important to getting through this polarization, especially for future generations. And then I think there's some institutional changes that can be made. A simple one, for instance, is to take away partisan gerrymandering and to create independent redistricting commissions for every single state in the country. We already have almost 20, I think, that do it like that, and take the power out of the hands of the politicians and put it into people that are more connected to the idea of not necessarily just which politician is going to win, but what's in the best interest of the folks out there on the ground that have to live with the consequences of the policies that they pass. So there are a lot of different ways that institutions can take actions to tamp down the polarization, and in the long term and short term, like improve our ability to connect with each other, to understand each other, and ultimately to grow as human beings. And you know, some places and some states are better than others right now at doing it, but I hope that DC will be more successful at doing it than it has been.
Jonathan, from your perspective, especially when we think about the social media piece of this, because it's here, I don't think it's going anywhere. Are there substantive changes you think could be made to social media to maybe depolarize the country a bit?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, tell us.
Absolutely. No, there's some big ones. Some of the biggest ones would be requiring identity authentication in order to post. It doesn't mean you have to use your real name. You can still post anonymously. But just as you can't walk up to a bank with a bag of money and say, open an account for John Smith, no ID, you know, banks have to know their customers. And I think if you're a large platform, over, you know, 1 million, some number, you are now having effects on the country. You are having enormous effects. We have to have know your customer laws so that before someone can open 1,000 accounts to harass people like Austin, they have to at least show that they're a real human being in a particular country, they're old enough to be using the platform, and I personally think they should have to show some form of ID, but that's negotiable. There are other ways to authenticate people with networks of trust. There are other ways to do it. And if that was the case, then at least the people on it have at least some accountability. They were vetted as a real human being. They're not bots. And then another thing, this would be the most powerful one that I can think of. Right now, the incentives on Twitter are the more of a jerk you are, the more successful you will be. Not in all sub-communities, but overall, if you're a jerk, you'll be more successful. How about if we change those incentives? How about if we code everybody for the degree of trollishness, and you could do this with either with AI, with crowdsourcing, and expert judgment, all three methods, and you triangulate, so that you get a score from 1 to 5. And if you're a 5, well, the rest of us, we have a filter, and it's by default set to 4. So I will only see people who are a 4 or below on trollishness. So if you're a 5, you disappear from me, I disappear from you. Now the incentives are reversed. And if I want, I can lower my trollishness to 1 and only have people who aren't complete jerks. So there are, you know, right now the social media platforms do whatever the hell they want. We are not their customers, we are the product. And so I had a session earlier with Frank McCourt, who's designing an entire new ecosystem based on Web3 that would make these kinds of authentication and having skin in the game make it easier. So there are some huge things we can do because in theory, as we thought in 2011, in theory this should be good for democracy. And the question is, why isn't it? And how do we get to a place where it is? We can do that.
Okay, so far we have create more public spaces where people can see and interact with one another. Get rid of gerrymandering, make some adjustments to social media, read Dale Carnegie, and Austin is someone who's doing this work at more of a grassroots level. If people want to engage in this, what are your suggestions?
Yeah, so my experience has been on a much more sort of intimate level, right? It's creating workshops, it's working as a resident director at a college where I'm responsible for 400 18 and 19-year-olds. It's, you know, it's being in and a part of a community and saying this is available to you, you know? I think an interesting correlation between sort of the government as institution, but schools as institutions and, right, or nonprofits as institutions is that there is a responsibility for them to also cast vision for who it is we want to be and what it is we want to do for one another, right? So working at a college where the vision is everybody belongs, well, now you have to teach and train students to that end, right? So if your student leaders now have lots of questions for, well, how do we do that well? If I've never met a Black person before, how do I make sure? Well, let me teach you. Right? Let me show you. Let me invite you to this movie, to this documentary. Let's create, right? But there are lots of intimate spaces that we can be creating where that persuading and educating and being intimate and not being anonymous, right, can actually take place. And Yeah, those are the spaces that I'd really love to occupy because they're more one-on-one in the same way that Lauren is working.
And Lauren, I want to hear from you as well, and specifically around engaging in this work with people who you have a lot of disagreements about. Because that's a very, let's just be honest, it is much more comfortable for us to be in a bubble with people who agree with us.
Yeah.
It's human nature, right? But you are purposefully putting yourself in spaces with people who don't agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and all I can say is that it's been some of the most rewarding human experience I've ever had. And in part because assumptions that I made about people were wrong. And I've had those with people who I politically disagreed with, the people that I disagreed with on religion. I can't not do it because it's so rewarding when we find those breakthroughs. And again, I can't say enough about this line around hate, and I really think that matters enormously. I mean, we all carry our own. We all have our own identity. You know, I'm Jewish. I've still in my lifetime unbelievably faced like really overt anti-Semitism. I have black kids. I live in a mostly white town. My kids have been targeted. I have had these experiences. I can't ever fully understand what it is to be a visible minority in this country, but still. So I draw those lines there, and I won't engage with someone who wants my death and destruction and who hates me. I think it's amazing, this guy that was working with the Ku Klux Klan. It's unbelievable to me. I'm obsessed with that story that Jonathan told because it's so unreal to me. But most people are not there. You know, most people just aren't. And when we give each other some benefit of the doubt on common humanity, on some common values, like you just never know where you're gonna go with that. And in the case of, some of the women that I work with, look, I mean, fundamentally, I believe, and I can't believe I didn't say this yet, but look, I fundamentally believe that one of the best ways to heal our torn, broken fabric of society is to have more women in positions of power and leadership everywhere. So I can't believe I buried the lead for like 45 minutes in. That I didn't say that in the first like 10 seconds is shocking to me. But I do because all the evidence is that when women lead, they're actually better at this. And we have a relatively limited sample size in this country because we still have never had more than 30% women in Congress, never more than 30% really in the state houses, except for one extra points to anyone who knows which one it is. It's Nevada, in case you're wondering, and Guam. But anyway, so we don't have a big data set, but where we do, like women do work together and find solutions because we put the values of our families ahead of ourselves. We put society ahead of our own self-interest. And there are exceptions to that, clearly in this state with a particular member of Congress. But for the most part, it's been a net positive. So that's what keeps me moving forward. People I disagree with, but that I hope we can find solutions with because we care about something greater than just ourselves.
We have just about just a few minutes before we go to questions. On our show, 1A, we do a lot of listener engagement. Lots of phone calls, voicemails, emails, tweets, Facebook messages.
Oh boy.
And overwhelmingly, what I've heard from listeners in recent months is a sense of fear. They fear the democracy is slipping away from us. They fear just a permanent split in the nation. And it's just a trend I've been seeing over really the past year, really. When you look at where the nation is right now, be it through a social lens, a political lens, I'll let you choose. Are you feeling hopeful in this moment? Lauren, I know you are.
I make myself feel hopeful because I think that despair is too paralyzing and keeps us from action. And if you don't believe that there's a path to progress, you won't fight for it. And I can't persuade other people to fight for it if I can't persuade them that there is a path forward. And so I make myself be hopeful, and I look for the green shoots, and it's a radical act of faith to commit to believing that we can make things better, and that we will.
Austin, what about you?
Yeah, for me, hope is a loaded term. I think I do. I think I am a prisoner of hope, but I speak more about duty. And I really feel that I have a duty to my ancestors and a duty to the kids who will come after me and a duty to myself to pursue justice, period. And so for me, I spend a lot less time thinking about whether or not I feel hope. I probably feel despair pretty frequently, but duty keeps me going when I experience despair.
Julian, what about you?
I'm fundamentally optimistic. I mean, I think that we're going through scary times right now, tougher times when it comes to our democracy and the subject that we're talking about, polarization among people than we have in a long time. I remain fundamentally optimistic that we're going to be able to get through this time period, whether it's by the reaction of institutions or individuals, right, that push back in our country. And it's not like our country hasn't seen very, very difficult and challenging times before, and that communities that are most targeted right now, I mean, are among the most resilient communities in our nation's history. And so because of that, I remain fundamentally optimistic that we're going to get through it.
If you have a question, please raise your hand. But Jonathan, I want to hear from you while we're taking.
Yeah, perhaps you shouldn't have ended with me. I used to be hopeful, but I escaped from it. But that's over the next 10 or 15 years. I think over the next 10 or 15 years, things are going to get a lot worse, like a lot worse. But if you take the big view of history, you know, as with markets, there are boom and bust cycles, and you can't just have the booms. And there are cyclical theories of history, you know, but they're on a longer periodicity, like around 80 to 100 years, these cycles. And a number of theories predicted we're at the end of one. And these were predictions made in the 90s and early 2000s. And the institutions that were made in the 20th century, in the age of mass media, were good for what they did, but they don't work anymore now. So there has to be a period in which they break. And so I think things are getting a lot worse, a lot more chaotic. But things don't just go one direction. And if you keep your eye on the fact that we're on a down cycle now, and eventually we'll be on an up cycle, we have a chance to be the greatest generation again. That is the generation that does, by the things we do now, we affect how deep it's going to go down, how much violence there's going to be down at the bottom, and how good the rebuilding is on the way up. So I am not hopeful, but I'm incredibly engaged and excited to be with people like here at Aspen. Most Americans are people of goodwill. Most Americans are exhausted what's happening. They want to live together with our diversity and differences. So I think in the long run we're going to make it through, but I have no idea how long that's going to be.
Questions, please raise your hand. Go ahead, sir.
Orrin Baird, and you've talked about interpersonal relations and how to convince people to come together, but you haven't talked at all about what I see as being the two forces that are really driving us apart. And one is the fact that a lot of politicians, an awful lot of politicians, view hate as being a good way to get elected and preaching hate. You know, gerrymandering just makes that worse. And also the broadcast media and some of the print media, which believes that preaching hate is a good way to make money. So I don't know, what do we do about that?
The media one is fraught for me, I'll be honest.
Same.
Yeah, because
Why don't you take this?
I'm just moderating. No, you know, I think the media question is a really difficult one because the media landscape has gotten incredibly noisy. At the same time, there's been a dip in media literacy. And so when you have organizations that can present themselves as news organizations, and there's no checks and balances on that, and we're expecting the populace to just magically know, and we don't take into account all of the human failures we have, our own biases, our own tendencies to reach for things that agree with what we already believe. It just becomes very difficult. And I don't know what the answer is for that other than increased media literacy. And not to convince people to listen to one side or another or this network or another network, but just to think critically about what they're hearing. That's the only thing I've been able to come up with. And I think it really has to start at the school level. Because the media landscape has changed so dramatically, I think we need to be teaching that kind of critical thinking from kindergarten on. because I don't think the landscape is going to get any less complicated. But from the political side of things, and we're talking about politicians who are running on platforms of hate, we're seeing Christian nationalism, white supremacy, the big lie. Julian?
Yeah,
I mean,
no, that's what I said early on, that you had I think Trump was qualitatively different, obviously, than anybody we've seen, and more successful even than like a George Wallace type from a couple of generations ago, because he became the president and did so fanning the flames of hate and division. And now, whether it's Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene, any number of them, they have found success. But the scary part to me is not just the politicians, it's that they wouldn't be winning those seats if that didn't sell, at least with the people who are showing up to vote. Now, mind you, sometimes that's a low percentage of the actual population.
Because it's the primary.
Made even lower also because of all of the obstacles that folks are putting in the way of people actually accessing the franchise. So I feel like the antidote to that is, among other politicians, calling them out very directly. That's why, my brother's in Congress, he represents the 20th Congressional District, and sometimes he gets an earful on what I think are, the Democrats not calling this stuff out enough and directly, because they don't want to do that to a colleague, and it's too, you use certain language and so forth. So there's that. I think on the media end, and I'm going through this weird experience now because I'm on MSNBC, and NBC is a contributor, and that's by no means a journalist, but at least I'm on that end, right? I think that one of the challenges with media, American media, in the modern version of it, has been that it both sides a lot of things, right, for forever. And I believe that actually inculcated in a lot of people who don't follow politics normally this sense that, oh, they're all the same. Like, yeah, these guys lie, and these guys lie, and Democrats do this, and Republicans do this. And that has a tendency, especially in moments of urgency, where there is a real stark difference between what these parties are talking about and the direction that they want to take our country, and only one of those parties would take our direction in an authoritarian, anti-democratic direction. But too many people just see it as 50-50, and even though the media have gotten better about that over the last few years, it took the Washington Post and the New York Times like years into Trump's term to actually use the word lie.
Yes.
That was a failure. So were the Hillary email stories that the New York Times did a while back, but that's another conversation. Is that American media itself, in a lot of ways, have not adapted the way they should to confront this anti-democratic, authoritarian move that is well underway and is real.
And I just want to add to that to say, part of the discussion we've been having in newsrooms over the past several years is about this idea of what it means to be neutral, right? And whether neutrality serves democracy. The idea of neutrality has historically been based on what it means to be neutral as a white man, right? So is it our job to just be neutral, or is it our job to tell the truth? And that has created a lot of tension in a lot of newsrooms, but it's something that we grapple with. On our show, we have certain lines, right? We're not going to give equal time to a climate denier as we do to a climate scientist. That's just, we're not going to do that. It's our job to tell the truth. But I think that's an ongoing conversation in a lot of newsrooms across the country. Not all, but many. I want to get to another.
I just got to say, let's see where let's watch this arc of history on the hate, because we're seeing a lot of these people lose. And I'm going to tell you, I think a lot more of them are going to lose in this cycle. Some of them are going to win. Yeah. There's no question that the way that our districts are set up, some of them are going to win. But just watch. Look at what happened in 2018, what happened in 2020, right? Americans are broadly pretty reasonable, thoughtful people who mostly reject hate, which is what we've been talking about, right? We've embraced it. We got pretty close to the line. But I think there are a whole bunch of races around the country we're going to see this year where we may see the pendulum go back.
We have another question down here.
Hi, Deirdre Byrne. I am in the despairing camp. I want to be right up front with that. You each talked about an interesting thing that we could change, and it would be probably necessary to legislate. gerrymandering, dealing with the issues of social media, hate crimes. But the people who can make these changes are uniquely disincentivized from doing that. So what do you see as the path forward? Because I'm not seeing anything in this Congress or in the Senate, even though it's 50-50, not to be a partisan, I'm not seeing any movement in that direction. So I'd love your opinions on that.
Who wants to take that? Go ahead.
A quick answer is, I think progressives, intellectuals tend to be too focused on the U.S. Congress, and there's a lot of different avenues for change. So Alaska was the first to implement Final Four voting, which I think is a great system, which will discourage the crazies from making it through to the general election, certainly. Yeah. And so that was done by popular vote, by referendum at the state level in Alaska. California, so the UK Parliament is actually very active in regulating social media, and the companies don't really want to make like a UK-specific brand, so they're actually having to roll out some of the child protective changes globally. The California legislature is about to adopt, or is likely to adopt, very much the UK code for social media for kids. So we focus on the Congress, which is, I think, broken and sick, and despite wonderful people in it, the dynamics, the incentives are messed up. Yeah. But there are a lot of other avenues for change. I think also on social media, competition. If we can, there are things we can do that don't require federal help to encourage alternate ways that we can connect and relate, which people would enjoy more. And so there are a lot of ways, but we do need to put pressure on the social media companies. We need to take off the pressure on Congress people to cater to the extremes, let them speak more broadly. So I think there are some systemic changes that don't require congressional approval.
Well, state and local politics, I mean, look, what Republicans have succeeded in doing is pushing pretty much every issue, every opportunity they get back to the states. Well, why is that a successful strategy for them? Because mostly Americans don't pay attention to what's happening in state and local politics. Most of us can't name who our state ledge or senator is. Most Americans can't also name their member of Congress, but we'll focus on the state and local. Voter turnout is extremely low. 25–30% of voters show up for local and state elections. And the reality is that most of social change, all the social movements that happened in this country over the last 50 years, started in the states. Gay marriage became law of the land because state after state after state legislature passed gay marriage. In New York, there was an intractable state legislature because there was a group of voting Democrats that were voting with Republicans that were blocking all the progressive legislation. They were there for years because no one was paying attention. And a young woman, Alexandra Biaggi, ran against the leader of this group in the state of New York. She's like 30, and she got people to pay attention to why this mattered in the state, and she won. And look at what's happening in New York right now. So the stuff is not intractable, but it takes us paying attention. Washington Post, democracy dies in darkness. Politics is going to die in darkness. If we don't pay attention to the local stuff, that's the path forward on so much that's happening in the country today, and it's accessible.
We have just a couple minutes left. We'll come back here. If we have time for one more question, we'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Sophia Ongel. I'm with an organization called Gen Z for Change, founded by this 18-year-old here.
So cool.
Yeah, he's really cool. Anyways, with this earlier conversation about hope, our generation can be very nihilistic because we had a very dystopian upbringing with climate change and having puberty on social media, and then Donald Trump being the president that we have the most memory of. So I wonder, as it relates to organizing, obviously we can't just give up because if we give up, the bad guys win. What advice do you have for coalition building and organizing in such a dystopian mindset?
Austin, you want to take that first?
Has your name on it.
Yeah, well, I personally am a big fan of looking back at history, right? And if we believe that history is cyclical, as has been said, right? Terrible things happen, but really magical things happen too. And it is really important to develop the courage and the bravery that it takes to look darkness in the face and say, not today. And so I think what I would personally encourage young people to do, right, is to not deny how terrible things are, right? I'm not asking for insanity, right? Like, let's acknowledge that this is not okay, and also you have the power to do something about it. You have the power. You are not You are not a cog in the wheel, right, in this large machine, and all you can do is keep spinning this direction, right? You can make a decision. And over history, that's what we have seen young people do.
That's right.
We have seen young people stand in the face of darkness and say, enough is enough, right? And so what would it look like to meet that nihilism with courage, right? Not to deny that things are terrible, but to say, I'm strong enough to stand up against this.
And we're technically out of time, but on the coalition building piece, any suggestions?
I mean, political change is fed from social movement. There's never been any political change in this country that was not driven by, to Austin's point, the mass mobilization of young people. And that, knowing that power, embracing that power, you're doing it. Mm-hmm. And you know, there's incredible things happening with young leaders today. The union movements that's happening in this country are all being run by young people.
Yes.
They got to go from the union vote to the ballot box. I know you did. That's amazing. So that is, I mean, talk about signs of hope. They're doing it. It's amazing. You deserve a lot of credit.
But we're out of time. Lauren, Austin, Jonathan, Julian, thank you for your time, and thank you.